What if the greatest palaces of Rome were not just decorated with marble, gold, and power, but with whispers of women who vanished without graves, whose names were erased, and whose only crime was marrying an emperor? Imagine the vast corridors of the Palatine Hill. Candles flicker, shadows crawl on painted walls, and behind the silken curtains lies the body of an empress, silent, cold, and forgotten. The senators will not mourn her. The poets will not sing of her, and the emperor, her own husband, will order her name scratched from every inscription, as if she had never been born. This is not a myth. This is the cruel reality of imperial wives. Women once adored, once crowned, then discarded like broken statues. Their beauty was a weapon, their wombs a battlefield, their loyalty a curse. For in Rome, to marry an emperor was not to live. It was to slowly die in silence. Let us begin with Claudia Octavia, the first wife of Emperor Nero. She was just a girl, barely 14, when she was forced into marriage with the most dangerous man in the empire. To the people of Rome, Octavia was beloved, noble, gentle, and innocent. But to Nero, she was nothing more than a political pawn. When he tired of her, he accused her of adultery, locked her in exile, and finally had her executed. Her head was sent to his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a gruesome wedding gift. The Roman crowds wept for Octavia, rising in protest, but their cries were silenced by the crack of soldiers' whips. Her body was never given a proper burial. Her name became a ghost. Then there was Fausta, the wife of Constantine the Great. History tells us she was executed in a bath of boiling water, accused of betraying her husband. But the truth is darker. Fausta had become too powerful, too influential in Constantine's court. Whispers say she was plotting to secure the throne for her sons. And in Rome, even the breath of ambition was fatal for a woman. Constantine, hailed as a Christian emperor, did not hesitate. He let her body dissolve in steam, and no prayer, no funeral, no holy blessing followed. The emperor who built churches left his wife to vanish, as if she had never drawn breath. And what of Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus? She was called the philosopher empress, a woman of intelligence and dignity, respected across the empire. Yet when her sons, Caracalla and Geta, turned on each other in a blood feud, Julia became trapped between monsters. Caracalla murdered his own brother in her arms, spattering her robes with her son's blood. Later, as Caracalla himself was struck down, Julia was left alone, ill and despised. She starved herself to death, her body consumed by despair. Rome had no space for mourning mothers, only for victorious men. The pattern repeats, over and over. Wives who could not produce heirs, who dared to speak, who threatened power, were erased. They were not honored as empresses. They were sacrificed as offerings to the gods of ambition. The marble statues of emperors still stand, but the faces of their wives have been hammered away, mutilated into blank stone. Even their portraits were cursed to disappear. And yet, sometimes their shadows return. Ancient inscriptions scratched hastily before being destroyed. A secret letter preserved by a slave. A fragment of bone unearthed in a shallow grave. They whisper that behind the mask of imperial Rome, there was another empire, one built on silence, the empire of forgotten wives. So, when we look at the Colosseum, at the Forum, at the triumphal arches, we see glory. But in the shadows of those monuments lies a truth. Rome's greatest victories were written in the blood of women, whose names you will not find in history books. Do we dare to speak their names now? Or will they remain, as the emperors wished, forgotten? The story of Rome's forgotten wives is not a tale of isolated tragedies. It is a chain, a necklace strung with broken pearls, each one cracked by betrayal, blood, and silence. To marry an emperor was to walk into a golden cage where every shadow concealed a dagger. Take Messalina, the third wife of Emperor Claudius. To the outside world, she was a woman of dazzling beauty, barely out of girlhood when she entered the imperial palace. But beauty in Rome was both weapon and curse. Messalina was accused of using her charm to manipulate senators, of selling favors for power, of indulging in unspeakable debauchery. Ancient writers, mostly men, painted her as a monster of lust. But can we trust them? Or was she simply a woman navigating survival in a court ruled by paranoia? The scandal reached its climax when she was accused of marrying her lover, Gaius Silius, in a secret ceremony while Claudius was away. Whether it was truth or fabrication, Claudius signed her death warrant without hesitation. Soldiers stormed the gardens where Messalina hid. She begged for mercy, but none came. History records that she tried to take her own life with trembling hands, unable to press the blade deep enough. A soldier finished the act, driving steel into her chest. Her body was abandoned, her name spat out as filth. But one must wonder, was she truly the monster Rome claimed, or merely a young woman destroyed by whispers crafted to erase her? Then there is Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, whose story twists with both power and terror. She was no ordinary wife. She was the widow of Emperor Claudius and the sister of Caligula. Her marriage to Claudius was not born of love, but of calculation, binding bloodlines and ambition. Agrippina maneuvered her son Nero onto the throne, and for a brief moment, she was the most powerful woman in Rome. But power in female hands was always branded dangerous. Nero soon grew weary of his mother's presence, her influence, her unyielding control. The son who owed his crown to Agrippina plotted her death. First, he lured her onto a ship designed to collapse into the sea. But Agrippina survived, swimming through the black water under the moon. Undeterred, Nero sent assassins into her villa. She faced them calmly, legend says, and when the blade was raised, she bared her womb and cried, "Strike here, where the monster was born." The son obeyed. Rome celebrated Nero's rule, but beneath that celebration lay the ghost of Agrippina, a mother murdered by the emperor she had created. The cruelty of emperors was not always loud. It was sometimes silent, like poison seeping into a cup of wine. Consider Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. She was admired as the perfect matron, wise and serene, the mother of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But rumors stained her legacy. Whispers claimed she arranged the deaths of rivals to ensure her son, Tiberius, would inherit the throne. Some said she poisoned Augustus himself, smearing a deadly substance on figs he loved to pluck fresh from the tree. Whether true or false, such whispers reveal the dark fate of imperial wives. Even when they survived, even when they wielded power, they were branded with suspicion, their names soaked in venom. The forgotten wives were not only killed, they were erased. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. To suffer it was worse than death. Your face would be chiseled off statues, your name carved out of inscriptions, your story unspoken. This was the fate of many empresses, reduced to faceless phantoms in marble. Their husbands sat on thrones of gold, while their wives dissolved into nothingness, existing only as rumors preserved by enemies. Yet fragments survive, an inscription half broken, carrying the faint outline of a name, a coin dug from the earth, its silver corroded, but still showing the faint profile of a woman once called Augusta. These remnants are like voices rising from the grave, refusing to be silenced. They remind us that these women lived, loved, and suffered, even if Rome tried to bury them under centuries of lies. It is tempting to believe that Rome, with all its grandeur, was a place of glory for those who stood beside emperors. But the truth is darker. The imperial bed was not a place of rest. It was an altar, and wives were the sacrifices. To marry a Caesar was to gamble with life itself, knowing the odds were always against you. So, when you hear the names of Augustus, Claudius, Nero, Constantine, remember that their crowns were not forged only from victories in war, but from the silence of wives who disappeared. Their ghosts linger in the marble halls, watching, waiting, whispering through history's cracks. Perhaps the greatest cruelty is this: not that they died, but that they were forgotten. And yet tonight we speak their names. In Rome, the marriage bed of an emperor was not a sanctuary, it was a battlefield, one where the weapons were poison, lies, and betrayal. And the victims, more often than not, were the women forced into it. Consider Lucilla, the daughter of Marcus Aurelius and the wife of Emperor Lucius Verus. She was married off at a young age, her body and future bartered like coin to secure alliances. When Verus died suddenly, some whispered of poison, others of plague. Lucilla was forced to remarry, this time to a man she despised, all for political convenience. But Lucilla was not content to be a pawn forever. She became entangled in a plot to assassinate her brother, Commodus, who ruled with cruelty and madness. The plot failed. Lucilla was exiled to Capri, where the waves beat endlessly against the rocks. One day, assassins arrived at her door. She was executed quietly, her body left in obscurity, her name smeared as a traitor. Yet, was she truly guilty of treason? Or was she simply a woman desperate to escape the prison that was Rome? Then there was Statilia Messalina, the third wife of Nero, who survived where others perished. But survival did not mean freedom. She had once been married to a nobleman, but Nero coveted her, and so her husband was forced to die. Statilia was then taken into Nero's palace, where refusal was not an option. She lived in the shadow of Poppaea Sabina's ghost, the mistress-turned-wife who had died, some say, from Nero's own brutal kick while pregnant. Statilia endured, her life a hollow victory. She did not perish in flames or poison, but she remained a prisoner of gilded walls, condemned to silence, forever tied to the name of a tyrant. The methods of destruction were often subtle. Poison was Rome's favorite weapon, and imperial wives were its most frequent victims. The art of poisoning was so refined that it was called ars veneni, the art of venom. A drop in a goblet of wine, a dust sprinkled over figs, a smear on the lips of a kiss. Death came slowly, invisibly. Many wives fell ill with sudden fevers, their bodies weakening without clear cause. Physicians whispered of curses, but servants knew better. To cross an emperor was to sip your last drink. One of the most chilling examples is the fate of Empress Crispina, wife of Commodus. She was known for her beauty, her quiet dignity, her devotion. Yet Commodus, mad with suspicion, accused her of adultery. The charge was almost always fatal, for it required no proof, only an emperor's paranoia. Crispina was banished to Capri, the same island that had become a graveyard for imperial women. Soon after, her life ended in silence, her story vanishing with the waves. Her statues were shattered, her name cursed, her memory condemned. What crime had she truly committed? None, except being married to a monster. But perhaps the most haunting stories are of those who never truly lived before they died. Young girls forced into marriage with emperors old enough to be their fathers or grandfathers. In these unions, innocence was sacrificed to power. These girls were expected to produce heirs before they even understood the meaning of love. Many died in childbirth, their bodies breaking under the weight of an empire they were too young to carry. Rome called it duty. Today, we would call it cruelty. One such girl was Claudia Pulchra, related to the imperial family, married off to secure bonds of power. She was later accused of witchcraft and adultery, charges so common they became a script for silencing women. Exiled, she wasted away far from the marble halls of Rome, another forgotten name, etched only faintly into history. We often imagine Rome as eternal, glorious, an empire carved from stone and steel. But within its palaces, women's lives were fragile as glass. They could be shattered with a rumor, dissolved with a sip of poison, erased with a stroke of the chisel. To be an empress was not to be immortalized. It was to live always at the edge of disappearance. Even those who outlived their husbands were not safe. Widowhood in Rome was a dangerous gift, for a widowed empress could still wield influence, still command loyalty. And so many of them were quietly removed, their deaths disguised as accidents or illnesses. Their bones were left to mingle with the nameless dead, their memory intentionally obscured, so the next empress could shine brighter before she too was cast aside. This was the cycle of Rome: beauty adored, power feared, loyalty punished. Each forgotten wife became a silent stone in the foundation of an empire built on cruelty. Their names echo faintly, like whispers down marble corridors where the past clings to shadows. And still the question lingers: how many more wives were lost, their names unrecorded, their faces ground into dust? How many women once walked the halls of power, only to vanish into the cracks of time? Rome will never answer. Behind the marble walls of Rome's palaces, history was not written in scrolls or carved on triumphal arches. It was whispered in bedchambers, poisoned in goblets, plotted in shadowed corridors. The emperors wore their crowns in daylight, but in the darkness of night, it was often their wives, or the women forced into that role, who held daggers, or felt daggers pressed against their throats. Consider Domitia Longina, wife of Emperor Domitian. She was beautiful, intelligent, and dangerous, at least in the eyes of Rome. At first, Domitian adored her, showering her with titles and wealth. But love in the palace was never safe. When rumors surfaced of her infidelity, Domitian cast her aside, only to recall her later when political convenience demanded. In the end, it was Domitia herself who was said to have conspired in his assassination. Whether this was truth or slander, her name became entwined with betrayal, and she passed into history not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a shadow, a woman accused of destroying the very man who once held her heart in chains. The wives of emperors lived in a paradox. If they were silent, they were discarded as useless. If they were ambitious, they were feared and eliminated. And if they tried to love, truly love, they were condemned. Rome had no space for women who were both human and imperial. Think of Aelia Eudoxia, wife of the Eastern Emperor Arcadius. She entered the palace as a teenage girl, raised high upon the throne, draped in gold and jewels. But beneath the glittering robes lay fragility. She was soon caught in the web of court politics, clashing with powerful bishops, accused of arrogance and corruption. When she died suddenly at the age of 26, whispers of poison spread through Constantinople. The emperor mourned, but her enemies celebrated, comparing her death to the fall of Jezebel. Her children survived, her name did not. Or take Aelia Flectilla, wife of Theodosius the Great, who was praised for her piety, her charity, her faith. Yet even in her sanctity, she was forgotten. Her death came quietly, without scandal, and yet Rome's historians brushed past her with barely a word. To be good was no guarantee of remembrance. In the empire, even virtue could be buried in silence. But the darkest tales come from those who became wives in name only. Political hostages, ornaments for ceremonies, pawns in the hands of emperors. Some were paraded through the streets in triumph, forced to smile at the adoring crowds, only to be locked in chambers afterward, their freedom gone forever. They lived in luxury, but died in despair. Their gilded cages were prisons more cruel than iron. The Romans themselves feared the curse of these forgotten women. Superstitions arose that the ghosts of murdered empresses lingered in the palace halls. Servants whispered of footsteps in empty corridors, of cold drafts sweeping through locked rooms, of faint voices weeping in the dead of night. Some said the spirit of Octavia still roamed, clutching her severed head. Others swore that Agrippina appeared by moonlight, pointing to her womb, demanding vengeance from her son. These stories were not merely fantasies. They were the conscience of Rome, haunting an empire that devoured its wives. For every emperor crowned in glory, there was a woman silenced in shadow. For every triumphal procession, there was a body hidden beneath the stones. And yet, we must ask, were these wives truly powerless? Or did they find ways to wield their suffering as weapons? Some used whispers, some used poison. Some used their children as pawns in their own games of survival. History, written by men, branded them monsters. Messalina the harlot, Agrippina the poisoner, Domitia the traitor. But perhaps they were not monsters at all. Perhaps they were women playing the only game allowed to them, the game of survival in a world where their lives were always expendable. Their power was real but fleeting, their punishments eternal, and their memory, fragile as parchment, easily burned, easily erased. When we walk among the ruins of the Palatine today, we see broken columns, shattered mosaics, fragments of frescoes depicting gods and victories. But what we do not see are the ghosts of the women who once paced those floors, their silk robes brushing the marble, their eyes heavy with fear. The ruins do not speak their names. They are forgotten wives, swallowed by history, abandoned by the very empire they once helped sustain. Perhaps the cruelest irony is this: the emperors who silenced them are remembered, their names engraved into every corner of history. But the wives who shared their beds, bore their children, and sometimes even ruled in their stead, were left to fade into dust, forgotten by Rome, but not by us. In the gilded halls of Rome, appearances were everything. The empire demanded spectacle, and so its emperors obliged. There were parades of triumph, banquets of unimaginable luxury, fountains spilling with wine, and dancers draped in gold. To the eyes of the people, the wives of emperors seemed blessed, wrapped in silks, crowned with jewels, seated beside gods in marble. But what the crowd saw was a mask. Behind the mask lay silence, terror, and decay. Take the imperial banquets, for instance. Guests reclined on couches while slaves poured wine, musicians played, and tables groaned under roasted peacocks and honeyed dormice. At the emperor's side sat his wife, adorned like a goddess. She smiled at senators. She raised her cup to the generals. Her laughter rang clear, as if she lived a life of joy. But every toast was a test, every sip of wine a gamble, for poison could hide in any cup, and suspicion lurked in every glance. The wife of an emperor learned quickly that her beauty was a costume, her smile a performance, her very survival an act played before an audience that longed to see her fall. Consider the fate of Poppaea Sabina, second wife of Nero. She dazzled Rome with her charm, her elegance, her radiant face carved into statues. To the people, she was a goddess of fertility and beauty, the perfect consort. But behind closed doors, her life was a nightmare. Pregnant with Nero's child, she became the target of his uncontrollable rage. Ancient accounts whisper that, in a fit of anger, Nero struck her in the abdomen, killing both mother and unborn child. The empress, who shone like Venus in public, was reduced to a lifeless body in private, her blood staining the very palace where she once reigned. The people saw only her statues. They never saw the horror of her end. Another tragedy cloaked in grandeur was that of Helena, the young wife of Emperor Julian, remembered by history as the apostate. Helena was born into royalty, sister to Constantius II, and given as a bride to secure political unity. She walked through palaces adorned with mosaics of gods, attended festivals where the empire celebrated her beauty, her piety, her position. Yet none of this grandeur could shield her from the cold reality of her womb becoming her grave. Helena died young, in childbirth, her body sacrificed to the endless Roman hunger for heirs. The empire cheered for the promise of her children, but when she perished, her name faded, her statues forgotten, her existence reduced to a footnote. This was the cruel paradox of imperial Rome. The empress was always seen, yet never truly known. Her image was painted on frescoes, stamped on coins, worshipped by the crowds, but her voice was silenced, her suffering erased. The more perfect she seemed in public, the more likely her private world was shattered by fear and violence. Even in their deaths, the charade continued. Funerals of empresses were staged as grand performances. Priests burned incense, musicians played hymns, senators marched in solemn procession. The empire wept for its goddess returned to the heavens. Yet many of these women had died not from illness or fate, but from murder, exile, or despair. Rome's pageantry did not mourn them. It buried the truth beneath ritual. This duality, splendor in daylight, terror in darkness, haunted every imperial wife. Imagine the nights after the feasts when the guests were gone, the music silent, the torches dimmed. Alone in her chamber, the empress removed her jewels, her painted face, her silken robe. Beneath the layers of gold was a body bruised by fear, weakened by childbirth, or trembling with dread of the emperor's next outburst. The empire called her divine, but in truth, she was a prisoner, caged not by chains of iron, but by the shimmering illusion of power. And perhaps that is why so many emperors feared their wives. For in those stolen private moments, wives knew the truth, that the empire itself was built on shadows. They saw the emperor not as a god, but as a man, flawed, cruel, fragile. They carried his secrets, his sins, his shame, and that knowledge made them dangerous. It was not beauty or ambition alone that condemned these women, but the simple fact that they knew too much. Rome could never allow its empresses to tell their stories, so it silenced them, in poison, in exile, in erasure. And the paradox remained. To the world, they were eternal goddesses. In reality, they were fragile, mortal, and forgotten. As we walk today among the ruins of Rome, the broken statues stare at us with hollow eyes. Many of these statues once bore the faces of empresses, but look closer. Their features have been deliberately scratched away, chiseled into blankness. This was not the work of time. This was deliberate, a punishment, a final act of damnatio memoriae. Rome wanted not only their bodies destroyed, but their very existence erased from memory. And yet, if you listen closely, their silence is not empty. It is a scream echoing through centuries, carried by stone, by dust, by the ghosts that refuse to rest. The forgotten wives of emperors are not gone. They are waiting to be remembered, waiting to reclaim their voices. History is not fair. It is written by victors, carved by men who saw women as pawns, and twisted by chroniclers who turned flesh and blood, wives into shadows, monsters, or myths. Among the forgotten empresses of Rome, some were not merely erased, they were demonized. Their names echo in records as whores, poisoners, traitors. But when we strip away the venom of propaganda, what remains? Women trapped in a labyrinth where every path led to ruin. Take Messalina, wife of Claudius, whose legend became infamous. Ancient writers painted her as a creature of insatiable lust, claiming she competed with prostitutes in brothels, that she betrayed her husband with countless lovers, that she even staged a mock marriage with her favorite, Gaius Silius, while Claudius still lived. To Roman historians like Tacitus and Juvenal, she was a cautionary tale of female corruption. But can we believe them? Or were they weaving a narrative to justify her execution? After all, Messalina was young, barely 20 when she died. She had influence, allies, and a son who might challenge imperial succession. In a world where women could not speak for themselves, slander was as deadly as a sword. By branding her a harlot, Rome ensured no one would mourn her. Yet perhaps in truth, she was simply a wife caught in the claws of men who feared her power. Then there is Agrippina the Younger, remembered as a scheming mother who poisoned her husband Claudius to place her son Nero on the throne. Writers claimed she was ruthless, manipulative, ambitious beyond all measure. They whispered of her using seduction as a weapon, even against her own son, suggesting incestuous desires to darken her legacy. But pause and think. Could any woman rise so high in Rome without being painted as a monster? Agrippina was intelligent, politically skilled, a survivor of countless threats. Her so-called ambition was perhaps the only means by which she could protect her family in a court where bloodlines were butchered overnight. Her fate, murdered by Nero, the very son she created, was not the end of a villain, but of a mother consumed by an empire that never allowed her to exist as anything but dangerous. Domitia Longina too was shrouded in suspicion. When her husband Domitian was assassinated, some sources accused her of conspiracy. To later historians, she was a faithless wife, a traitor. But others suggest she tried desperately to protect him, even after years of fear and abuse. Which version is truth? We may never know. What we do know is that her story was rewritten by those who sought to justify Domitian's fall. Better to remember him as betrayed by his wife than as a tyrant hated by his empire. And so, Domitia became the scapegoat. Another woman turned to shadow. This demonization was not accidental. It was a political tool. By making empresses into symbols of corruption, Rome justified its brutality. To kill a wife was murder. To kill a harlot, a poisoner, a traitor, that was justice. The empire rewrote truth so thoroughly that even centuries later, we still debate whether these women were villains or victims. And yet, when we look closer, fragments of their humanity survive. A letter preserved on papyrus, praising Agrippina's wisdom. A statue head of Messalina, her face serene, far from the grotesque caricature painted by satirists. A coin bearing Domitia's profile, stamped with the title Augusta, proof of her honor in her own time. These fragments whisper of women who were complex, intelligent, human, far more than the monsters Rome turned them into. Perhaps the cruelest example of all was the treatment of Fausta, wife of Constantine the Great. Some accounts accuse her of adultery with her stepson. Others claim she falsely accused him of seducing her. In either version, she emerges as deceitful, dangerous. But what if the truth was simpler? That Fausta, caught in the crossfire of dynastic politics, was destroyed because she stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Constantine ordered her death in boiling steam, a punishment so brutal it feels less like justice than vengeance. Yet even in this, history left her no dignity. She was remembered only as a cautionary tale, her voice drowned in accusation. The forgotten wives of emperors were not only killed, they were cursed by memory. Rome feared them even after death. To remember them truthfully was dangerous, for it would expose the empire's cruelty. Better to brand them harlots than martyrs. Better to call them poisoners than victims. Better to turn them into shadows than to admit that Rome itself devoured its women. And so, the question lingers. How many of these so-called monsters were simply women fighting to survive? How many were erased not because of their sins, but because of their silence? The ruins of Rome will not answer. The stones hold their secrets tightly. But in the cracks, in the faint inscriptions, in the broken coins, in the whispers of ghosts, we catch glimpses of truth, that behind every emperor stood a wife, and behind every forgotten wife stood a story the empire tried to bury. They called them harlots, traitors, poisoners. But perhaps their only crime was being wives of emperors. To outlive an emperor was not salvation. For many imperial wives, widowhood was not freedom. It was exile, suspicion, or execution. The empire that once bowed before them quickly turned away, casting them into the shadows as if their presence alone threatened the stability of Rome. Take Plautilla, the young wife of Emperor Caracalla. She married him when still a girl, paraded through the streets as Augusta, adorned in silks, her image stamped on coins. To the people, she was Rome's empress, a symbol of fertility and hope. But Caracalla despised her. He tolerated her only as long as his father, Septimius Severus, lived. Once Severus died, Plautilla's fate unraveled. She was exiled to the barren island of Lipari, where the sea winds howled against stone walls and loneliness gnawed at her every hour. There she remained, forgotten, until Caracalla ordered her strangled, her body tossed away like refuse. She had survived her husband, but survival only delayed the cruelty of Rome. The same fate awaited Crispina, wife of Commodus. Once crowned Augusta, praised for her beauty, she was accused of adultery after Commodus grew paranoid. Banished to Capri, she too died quietly, her name condemned, her statues destroyed. To outlive Commodus would have meant nothing. Her death came long before his, yet even in widowhood, she would have been erased. But there were wives who did live beyond their emperors, and for them, widowhood was a different kind of death. Consider Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus. She survived him, living into her 80s, one of the most powerful women Rome ever saw. Yet, even she was not spared suspicion. After Augustus's death, whispers spread that she had poisoned him, smearing deadly paste on his favorite figs. When her son Tiberius ascended the throne, he treated her coldly, refusing her honors, denying her the title she sought. Livia lived on, but in her final years, she was isolated, mistrusted, her legacy tangled in shadows of venom. Even in power, widowhood was loneliness. Another chilling tale is that of Julia Domna, widow of Septimius Severus. She had been revered as the philosopher empress, traveling with her husband across the empire, advising him, embodying dignity. But when Severus died, her world collapsed. Her sons, Caracalla and Geta, tore each other apart in civil war. Julia tried to keep peace, but her efforts failed. Caracalla murdered Geta in her arms, splattering her with her own child's blood. After Caracalla's later assassination, Julia was left alone, despised by the new regime. Ill and broken, she refused to eat, starving herself until death claimed her. She had survived her emperor, but her widowhood became a slow, deliberate suicide. Widowhood for imperial women meant invisibility. Some were sent into exile, far from the city, where their deaths would pass unnoticed. Others were placed under guard, treated as prisoners in their own villas. The empire could not tolerate widows who still carried imperial blood, for they might become rallying points for rebellion. A forgotten wife was safer than a living one, and so Rome's widows became phantoms, locked away, erased from memory. Even when honors were given, they were hollow. Funerals for empresses were grand, but they served the living, not the dead. The Senate decreed divine titles, statues erected, temples built. Yet these honors were not meant to remember the woman, but to glorify the emperor she once lay beside. The widow's body became a symbol, her memory twisted into propaganda, her true life erased. The paradox deepens when we recall the empire's obsession with lineage. Empresses were expected to bear heirs, yet if their sons lived, they too became threats. Widowhood often left them trapped between protecting their children and surviving themselves. To succeed meant being seen as ambitious, manipulative, dangerous. To fail meant obscurity. Either way, Rome condemned them. Imagine the silence of those palaces after an emperor's death. The torches extinguished, the courtiers vanished, the once bustling halls now heavy with suspicion. A widow sat alone, stripped of her titles, her jewels, her power. Yesterday she was called Augusta, mother of the empire. Today she was nothing, an old woman, a liability, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. How many widows wandered those halls, unseen, unheard? How many survived the emperors only to wish they had died with them? Rome's cruelty did not end with life. It continued into widowhood until every empress was either erased, demonized, or turned into a hollow symbol. Their humanity was the true casualty, their voices lost in the dust. To outlive an emperor was not victory, it was the most silent of defeats. The Roman Empire was not only ruled by emperors, senators, and legions. It was ruled by fear, and in fear, the dead never rested. Among the most unsettling whispers that traveled through the marble corridors of palaces were tales of women who refused to remain silent even in death. Forgotten wives, murdered mothers, discarded brides, their bodies destroyed, but their spirits unyielding. Rome could erase names from inscriptions, but it could not silence the echoes that haunted its stones. The Romans themselves believed in restless spirits, lemures and larvae, the wandering dead who had been denied proper burial or justice. And who had more reason to linger than the wives of emperors? They had been silenced, erased, abandoned. Their tombs, if they had them at all, were often empty of honor. Their deaths were shrouded in lies. Such souls, the Romans said, rose again at night, walking the halls where they once lived, seeking vengeance, or at least remembrance. One of the most terrifying legends is that of Octavia, Nero's first wife. After her execution, her body was not honored, her ashes not cherished. Yet not long after, people whispered that her ghost wandered the Palatine Hill. Citizens claimed they heard her cries in the dead of night, a woman weeping for her lost youth, her severed head, her stolen life. Some swore her ghost appeared drenched in blood, clutching the veil torn from her wedding day, staring at Nero's chambers with hollow eyes. Even Nero, drunk with power, feared her spirit. They say he awoke screaming in the night, calling for torches, for music, for anything to drown the silence that pressed against him. But nothing could drown a ghost. Then there is the tale of Agrippina the Younger, murdered by her own son. After Nero's assassins pierced her womb with blades, her villa became a place of dread. Servants reported cold winds sweeping through locked chambers, lamps extinguishing themselves, shadows moving where no one stood. Sailors near the Bay of Naples whispered of a pale woman rising from the waters, her arms outstretched, her voice a whisper. Strike the womb. Even centuries later, people avoided the ruins of her villa, fearful of the mother who had become a specter of vengeance. The cruelty of Rome gave birth to countless such stories. Every empress murdered, exiled, or erased became a seed of fear in the collective memory. Poppaea Sabina, struck down by Nero while carrying his child, was said to haunt the palace with the cries of an unborn infant. Fausta, boiled alive in her bath by Constantine's order, was believed to scream in steam rising from the palace baths, her agony echoing in every hiss of water. Even Julia Domna, who starved herself after losing her sons, was remembered as a ghostly figure wandering libraries, clutching scrolls of philosophy she once cherished, her hunger not for food, but for the justice Rome denied her. These stories were not merely superstitions, they were confessions. They revealed a truth Rome tried to bury, that the empire was built not only on triumphs and monuments, but on crimes too great to silence. The people may have bowed to emperors in daylight, but at night, they whispered of the women the emperors destroyed. In their minds, the wives had become something more powerful than goddesses, spirits of vengeance who could not be controlled. The imperial palaces themselves became theaters of haunting. The Palatine Hill, glittering by day, was feared by night. Slaves refused to walk its corridors after dark, claiming to hear footsteps behind them, veils brushing against their skin, faint laughter of women long dead. Guards drank themselves numb to forget the faces they glimpsed in torchlight, faces of empresses whose portraits had been scratched from stone, now staring back in fleshless form. The baths of Fausta, the gardens of Messalina, the villa of Agrippina all became places where Romans whispered of curses. Perhaps these hauntings were not supernatural at all, but the guilty conscience of an empire. Rome prided itself on justice, on law, on the dignity of the paterfamilias. Yet within its most sacred household, the emperor's own, the laws were broken, the women slaughtered, the justice denied. The ghosts were not phantoms of the underworld. They were memories the empire could not erase. Even centuries later, when the Western Empire had crumbled, the stories lived on. Medieval travelers spoke of ruins where women's voices still wept. Pilgrims claimed to feel cold hands at their throats as they passed Nero's golden palace. And in forgotten chapels, prayers were whispered not for emperors, but for the wives they destroyed. The forgotten wives became immortal, not through marble or coin, but through fear, legend, and the restless persistence of their spirits. So, when we walk today through the ruins of Rome, we see empty chambers, broken arches, silent stones. But silence can deceive, for perhaps if we listened closely, we might still hear it, the faint rustle of silk on marble, the distant cry of a woman denied her grave, the echo of a name Rome tried to erase. And then the question comes, were these ghosts real, or were they the truth Rome refused to tell in daylight, forgotten in life, immortal in haunting? The emperors of Rome believed themselves gods. They were worshipped in temples, their faces stamped on coins, their names sung in triumph. They could order armies to march, cities to burn, wives to die. Yet even the mightiest emperor could not escape the shadows of his own crimes. For every wife silenced, every empress erased, there was a price, and the price was always blood. Consider Nero, perhaps the most infamous of all. He murdered his first wife Octavia, gifting her severed head to Poppaea. Then he killed Poppaea too, striking her down in rage while she carried his child. He drowned in suspicion, surrounding himself with cruelty, believing that he could erase the past. But Rome remembered. The people whispered Octavia's name in secret, mourning her. The senators despised him. The soldiers grew restless. When rebellion rose, Nero found himself alone, abandoned even by those who once praised him. Terrified, he fled into the night, begging his servants for help, but there was no salvation. In the end, he drove a dagger into his own throat, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." He thought himself a god, yet he died like a coward. Was this not the vengeance of the wives he betrayed? Or think of Commodus, whose paranoia condemned his wife Crispina to exile and execution. He believed eliminating her secured his power. Yet soon after, Commodus descended into madness. He styled himself as Hercules reborn, wielding a club, dressing in lion skins. He fought in the arena like a gladiator, humiliating the empire. The Senate plotted his death. The people laughed at his insanity, and in the end, his mistress poisoned him, while an athlete strangled him in his bath. The man who killed his wife was himself killed by a woman's hand. Some Romans whispered that Crispina's ghost had guided the assassin's grip. Then there was Caracalla, who ordered his wife Plautilla strangled in exile. He thought her death erased a rival, a liability. But what followed was a reign steeped in blood. Caracalla became infamous for massacring thousands, including entire cities. Yet his cruelty earned him no loyalty. On the road to the east, one of his own soldiers struck him down while he relieved himself, his body left dishonored. Rome muttered that it was justice. The same dishonor he gave Plautilla returned to him in filth. Even emperors who cloaked themselves in piety were not spared. Constantine the Great, hailed as the first Christian emperor, boiled his wife Fausta alive. He justified it as punishment for adultery, but the act stained him forever. Though he built churches and spread the cross, whispers haunted him that the first Christian emperor had murdered his own queen in fire and steam. His later years were plagued with unrest and suspicion, his dynasty poisoned by distrust. For what kingdom can stand when its very foundations are built on family blood? This was the hidden law of Rome. The throne consumed those who consumed their wives. For every woman cast aside, every body disposed of, every name erased, the empire seemed to take its toll. The men who believed themselves eternal found themselves undone by madness, by betrayal, by disgrace. But perhaps the truest punishment was not political. It was psychological. Many emperors lived haunted by the very women they killed. Suetonius records Nero screaming in his sleep, seeing Octavia's ghost. Stories spread of Caligula, who exiled and executed women of his own family, only to wander the palace at night, shrieking at shadows no one else could see. Even Tiberius, who may have inherited power thanks to Livia's schemes, spent his final years on Capri surrounded by paranoia, seeing betrayal in every face. The ghosts were not phantoms. They were memories, guilt, the cracks in divine illusion. Rome celebrated emperors in marble, but the marble could not silence the whispers. The wives they destroyed became their true judges, forgotten by history's official scrolls, but not by fate. Forgotten in words, but alive in the vengeance of consequence. In this way, the forgotten wives were never truly forgotten. They became part of Rome's curse. For every emperor who rose, another wife was sacrificed. For every sacrifice, another shadow was cast. And in those shadows, the empire slowly rotted from within. The lesson is bitter. Power gained through blood always demands repayment. The emperors believed they buried their wives, but it was their wives who buried them, forgotten in life, avenged in death. In the end, the story of Rome is not only the story of emperors and battles, of conquests and triumphal arches. It is the story of silence, the silence of women who once sat beside the most powerful men on earth, whose names were erased, whose lives were bartered, whose deaths were hidden. The wives of emperors were queens of marble in public, but prisoners of fear in private. They were praised, adorned, and worshipped, but only until they became inconvenient. Then they were discarded, executed, condemned to oblivion. Octavia, executed by Nero, her head sent as a gift of cruelty. Messalina, accused of lust, struck down by rumor and steel. Agrippina, mother and maker of Nero, stabbed in her womb by the son she gave power to. Poppaea Sabina, killed by a kick while pregnant, reduced to whispers of blood. Fausta, boiled alive by Constantine, her screams rising in steam. Julia Domna, starving herself into death after watching her sons slaughter each other. Plautilla, exiled to a barren island, strangled in silence. Crispina, condemned for adultery, erased from every stone. Their names flicker across history like dying flames, faint, fragile, nearly extinguished. And yet, they endure. For though emperors commanded armies and ordered deaths, they could not control memory. Statues were chiseled, inscriptions destroyed, yet fragments survived. A coin in the soil, a broken bust, a line in a forgotten scroll, tiny pieces of resistance against oblivion. These fragments remind us that the forgotten wives were real, that they lived, suffered, and loved, even if Rome sought to erase them. Their tragedy is not just that they died, but that they were denied the dignity of remembrance. Rome built monuments to victory, but none to its forgotten women. The Colosseum still stands, the arches still rise, the palaces still crown the Palatine Hill. But the true foundation of Rome was not marble, it was blood. And much of that blood belonged to women whose only crime was to stand too close to power. The empire thought it silenced them, but their silence is louder than marble. Their absence is a presence. Their shadows linger in the ruins, in the cracks of history, in the unease that clings to Rome's glory. And perhaps this is their final vengeance. The emperors are remembered for their wars, their titles, their madness. But the wives, though forgotten, haunt us more, for their stories reveal the truth Rome tried to bury. That power without mercy devours itself. That every empire, no matter how great, rots when it builds its throne on broken lives. So, as we walk among the ruins today, let us not only see the stones, the arches, the grandeur, let us listen. For in the silence you may hear them still. The footsteps of Octavia, the whispers of Agrippina, the cry of Poppaea, the shadow of Julia. Forgotten wives, but never truly gone. And in that silence, one question remains. If the greatest empire in history was built on the erasure of its women, then what truly was Rome's legacy? Was it conquest, or was it cruelty? Was it glory, or was it a mausoleum of forgotten wives? The answer does not lie in marble, it lies in the shadows.